While we're all concerned about the pandemic, and rightfully so, we shouldn't become so focused on the experience of people exactly like us here inside of the United States that we forget that some communities are being hit much harder and are being hit in a way that isn't necessarily being focused on or reacted to. And so to help fill in some of those gaps, I'd like to welcome back to the show the Executive Director of We Exist Too, Ahmad Ibsais. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you on. And, I know that you've been doing a lot of writing recently about how the pandemic is affecting refugee populations. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, of course. So we don't see the extreme refugee crisis here in the United States, and there's not a big refugee population here, at least where I am, in Sarasota, Florida. So sometimes it's kind of hard for a lot of us to gauge what's happening on the other side of the world. So I've been trying to write and organize my own community to kind of recognize the refugee crisis because there's so many people, over 70 million people suffering internationally and that are internally displaced within their own countries and communities that are not getting recognized by any country. So they're not getting any sort of health care, food, water, housing, any sort of infrastructure.
Mhm. So, I've been wondering now for some time, some of
Mhm.
these communities, whether it's like refugee communities, or I know, the situation in Yemen, that they've been absolutely
Mhm.
devastated by disease already. Some of these areas, do we have any idea how much coronavirus there is there? Is there testing going on at all? If it's rampaging through these communities, would we
Mhm.
even know?
Yeah, so that's the big issue with a lot of these communities being internally displaced as well as internationally displaced is that they don't have their own kind of country or land that or government that's even giving them any sort of testing. So we don't know how big coronavirus is within these communities. And because of these communities have no access to healthcare and are put in such tight quarters, they're the perfect breeding ground for coronavirus and other sorts of infectious diseases and community diseases.
In the lead up, the last couple of years, I know that Donald Trump has successfully cut the number of refugees that we resettle internally in the U.S., and I know that the European response to some of the refugees crossing the Mediterranean has been horrendous, better
Yeah.
in some ways. And so there was already a lot of trouble with getting help to these people. With so many countries dealing with coronavirus internally, do you see much outreach either from the UN or from the EU? Is there any aid being offered to some of these communities during the pandemic?
Yeah, so the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, is doing their best, but they only receive half the aid that they actually need
Mm,
to provide any sort of relief to the refugees. But there's a lot of organizations like UMR, which is the United Mission for Resource and Development, which does a lot of work with Muslim refugees because approximately a little bit over 50% of refugees are Muslim refugees. So
okay.
there's a lot of organizations doing on the grounds work, but not so much of a governmental work to help refugees.
Yeah, do you have any suggestions on what you think? Is there anything that the U.S.
Mhm.
government should be doing, or that you'd like to see the UN do? Obviously, having more funding would be good, but what are some specific efforts that you'd
Mhm.
like to see them engage in?
Well, of course, I'd first like to see like the United States and other Europeans just at least recognize the extent of the refugee crisis because, like I said, there's 70 million people pretty much suffering without any access to relief, food, water, electricity, healthcare. So just first of all, recognizing and then educating our communities on what we can do individually to help, whether that's donating food packages or like this Sunday is going to be Eid, which is a Muslim celebration. And all of these Muslim children are not going to have any sort of celebration in their own right. Most of them won't have any food. So whether that's like toy drives or, like I said, food services, there's a lot of ways in which we can help individually and either send aid or give aid within our own community.
Are there any specific organizations that you've perhaps worked with in the past that you think have a good reputation or reputable that perhaps viewers of this video could provide some support to?
Yes, like I said, UMR and also UNRWA, which is helping Palestinian refugees, especially during Ramadan, which is about to end.
Okay. And I'm curious, like looking forward.
Mhm.
Let's say, we get past the pandemic, we get past potentially a second wave that comes.
Mhm.
What do you think looking forward over the next few years to the next like 5 years or so? Do you think that some of the experience of the pandemic, especially the the xenophobia towards China, the concern over international travel. Do you fear that that might sort of linger in people's minds, fear of bringing people in, having relatively open borders, that might hinder efforts to provide more assistance to refugees in the future?
Yeah, so this refugee crisis has pretty much been ongoing for decades, and the xenophobia in America has also been going ongoing for centuries. So like you said, xenophobic issues and issues with immigration is going to exist long after coronavirus. But I think as like global citizens, we need to recognize that it's our duty to help the most vulnerable, and just like I said, educate our communities to see that these people are suffering kind of the worst human conditions that any of us will experience, and that it's our duty to kind of give aid where we're able to.
100%.
Because we
Yeah.
are
And
coming from a place of privilege.
oh, 100%. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I try to tell people all the time, like I'm even inside of the United States case, the fact that I'm one of the lucky few who's able to work from home, like
yeah,
I try to bear that in mind, and so I want to thank you for coming on. I know that everybody's dealing with stuff here, but I don't want them to forget that there are other communities that have it much worse and that already had it really bad before the pandemic added on to these problems. So, Ahmad, as always, we
of
appreciate
course.
you joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day.
You too. For more political news, breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.